Thank you for inviting me to be here today to talk about how we might assess research culture in a practical and responsible way. What I'm hoping to cover in the next 15 minutes or so is firstly, what is this link between research culture and research assessment, and why we need to be a little bit careful about how we might go about addressing any negative aspect of that relationship. And then I'm going to finish up with some practical guidance as to how we can assess well in order to improve our research cultures, and also how we might assess well our actual research cultures, drawing on some examples of how folk in the UK sector are already doing this. So, firstly, what exactly is the problem here? How does research assessment actually impact on research culture? Well, I think our first issue is simply the volume of research assessment that our researchers, our groups, our institutions are actually subject to. So we all know that researchers are assessed for recruitment and promotion and probation and prizes and grants and fellowships and awards, journal peer review. They're assessed by funders, by employers, by myriad agencies that set themselves up as researcher ranking bodies. They're assessed by each other. They're assessed quantitatively and qualitatively by human and now by machine. And they're probably one of the most assessed professions in the world. And whilst no doubt some of this is necessary, in a world of limited resources, we need to identify who the winners might be and who might get those resources. It's not all necessary. We measure far too much. And it's no wonder that when the Wellcome Trust asked what words researchers would use to describe their research culture, the results showed a highly competitive, insecure and pressured environment that was ultimately underpinned and fueled by metrics. And of course, those metrics don't cover the full gamut of researcher activity, but are largely publication metrics, as this survey of researchers by the European University Association showed in 2019, where 80% of researchers claimed that publications were very important to their career progression. And the only other thing that came even close was grant income at 57%, so not that close. And other things that we might claim to care about at the bottom there, like the societal impact of our research and open science, we're a long way off having any impact at all on career progression. And of course, we all know the cost of focusing entirely on publication metrics, particularly this community, is that this is leading to a significant volume of questionable research practices, retractions, paper mills, as researchers will pursue headline-grabbing publications in highly cited journals rather than solid discovery-led scholarship. It leads to even higher publication costs, exacerbated unwittingly by the drive towards open research, as those highly cited journals that they're all pursuing can pretty much charge what they like for article processing charges. And it leads to equity, diversity and inclusion issues, as the bibliometrics that are used to assess publication success favour largely white males, English speaking, in the global north. And if you need any evidence for this, just look at any bibliometric based researcher ranking and see who wins. And I'm not sure how clear that slide is, but this is the best biology and biochemistry scientists from research.com, and you can see there at a glance what the demographic is. So essentially, the reason that research assessment negatively affects research culture is that what we measure is what we get. And I often say to universities, you show me your research KPIs, I will show you your research culture, because what we really care about will be right there in terms of the things that we say that we value, that we're pursuing, and therefore that we're measuring. In fact, I would go as far as to say that all REF really need to do to assess research culture is to take a look at institutions' KPIs, not only what's there, but what isn't there, and to hold them to account for making good on those indicators, but I'll come back to that point. So I'm not the first to make the link between research culture and assessment, and there is, of course, a significant reform movement afoot, which is great. However, I think there are a few things we need to be a little bit cautious about as we proceed to fixing this problem. And I just want to highlight a few solutions here that are being pursued that might mean we don't get to where we want to go on this. And the first of these is a propensity to add new things to our assessments without reweighting the old things. So whilst there's a lot of activity around valuing a broader range of things in our assessments now, societal impacts, open research, which is brilliant, what we're not so good at yet is putting enough value on those new things so that they actually make a difference to the outcomes of our assessments. There's no point measuring what matters if we're still heavily weighting the things that don't. So this is quite an interesting case in point. So CoARA have an academic career assessment working group that ran a survey of institutions, asking those already engaging in research assessment reform what they are currently assessing and what they might seek to assess in the future. So we can see at the top there that right now research publications are the most heavily assessed. That's the turquoise blue line. The line colours are not too clear, I apologise for that. But whilst in a reformed scenario, the expectation was that publications might be slightly less heavily assessed, they were still one of the most heavily assessed elements. And the only other element that would increase beyond this 4 out of 5 importance threshold in any new scenario was grant income, which is not exactly the direction in which we want to head, especially as many funders are, of course, now recognising that research funding is so difficult to assess fairly that they are turning to lotteries to do that. So what we might end up with is a whole lot of new stuff being added to the assessment pile, so more assessment, not less, with no real reduction in the importance of publications. The second thing I think we're prone to is incentivising things through assessment that we should perhaps be incentivising in other ways. So we latch on to Campbell's law that what we measure is what we get, and we seek to assess the things we want rather than the things we don't want, which seems very logical, without wondering whether we actually need to assess them at all. So the Centre for Open Science gave us this research culture change pyramid a few years ago that reminded us that we need to make change possible and easy and normative before we make it rewarding and required. And I would put for some things in life, I think, I don't even think they really need to be rewarding. They just need to be required. So I just don't think that incentives piece is always needed. And I would put many elements of research culture, such as open research and research integrity, in that category. They are hygiene factors. They are fundamental requirements for health and well-being, like recycling and health and safety regulations in our labs, without which things can go badly wrong, but the pursuit of which is not going to get you out of bed every morning. We don't need to assess hygiene factors. We don't need recycling rankings and gold stars for achievement. There just needs to be negative consequences if those basic hygiene standards aren't met. And this is how, of course, openness was assessed in REF 2021 and will be the same in REF 2029. There's no star ratings for openness, but a basic expectation that 95% of your outputs will be open access, and if you fail to meet that threshold, there are consequences. The third thing that we are prone to is incentivising and assessing the good stuff without thinking about how we disincentivise. Oops, I don't know why this is. Excuse me. We incentivise and assess the good stuff without thinking about how we disincentivise the bad stuff. And I think this is a really tricky thing to fix. I muse on this a lot. I'm hoping I might get some ideas from Kat's presentation in a moment. And I'm often heard saying that your research culture is defined by the worst behaviour you are prepared to tolerate. So how do we ensure that not only good behaviours are on the increase, but that bad behaviours are on the decrease, or preferably that they don't exist at all? And how do we measure that? And if we're going to let someone's grant income record excuse their toxic behaviours, frankly, our research culture KPIs are not worth the paper they're written on. We saw this in action in the last ref, where UCL's Bartlett Institute for Architecture got a 100% rating, for a 4-star rating, sorry, for research environment, but then 3 weeks later hit the headlines for bullying and sexual misconduct. And that 4-star rating still stands, by the way. They're still reaping the financial benefits of that 4-star rating. So are we confident that our research culture assessments will not only highlight the shiny features of our research and development programmes, but expose and disincentivize the grubbier end of our research cultures? And I've picked on UCL here, I apologise. There are dark corners in any organisation, certainly any large complex organisation. How do we handle that? And the final thing that we often do, quite understandably, is to focus on those areas of the research ecosystem over which we have jurisdiction, such as our own researchers, our own research groups, whilst ignoring the wider ecosystem, including other stakeholders and other global regions, which have such a significant influence on our activities. Desmond Tutu, of course, taught us that there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they are falling in. And if we look at the research assessment food chain, many of the calls to do research better, research assessment better, are aimed at universities that admittedly do play a significant role in assessing researchers. But we do have to remember that universities only measure because they are measured. And evaluators are everywhere. As we've talked about, we have REF, we have programme accreditations, we have funder audits, we have the university rankings, and we have data sources that are still largely publication-based. So whilst the finger is often pointed at institutions to value a broader range of things to improve research assessment and culture, it's extremely difficult to do this whilst you're being assessed on a very narrow range of things by a whole host of third-party evaluators. And of course, our apex predator here is the global university rankings, which in conjunction with a lot of bibliometric commercial vendors are responsible for a lot of poor assessment behaviours across the rest of the research ecosystem. A lot of universities claim that they care about equity and assessment reform, but ignore the fact that this requires engagement beyond their own institution and beyond their own country. And of course, a risk-free way of expressing your concern about the negative impacts of the global rankings is to join the INORMS More Than Our Rank initiative. So a quick plug for that, which is essentially a narrative CV for universities, and it allows all institutions to describe their activities and ambitions and achievements that are not captured by the single numbers that are offered by the global rankings, whilst not requiring them to disengage with the rankings, because we recognise the power that they hold over the sector right now. So I talked about the link between research assessment and culture and some of the traps we can fall into when trying to address that issue. I did promise I would provide some practical ideas as to how we might do this better. So I want to finish up by very briefly outlining another INORMS initiative, which is the INORMS SCOPE Framework for Responsible Research Assessment, which is a very simple tool that we can all use to either evaluate existing assessments or to design new ones in responsible and meaningful ways. So SCOPE operates under 3 principles. Firstly, to evaluate only where necessary. As we've talked about, research and researchers are very heavily evaluated. There's an increasing use of assessment to incentivise certain behaviours, but we know that over-assessment is having this negative impact on research culture globally. So this principle is a challenge to evaluators to say, do you need to evaluate at all? Is it evaluation or enabling that you need to do? Measurement is not always the answer. The second principle is that where we do evaluate, we always do so with the evaluated. So the world is recognising the nothing about me without me principle in all walks of life. Evaluation is the same. Evaluation should be co-designed and co-interpreted by the communities being evaluated. And the third is to draw on evaluation expertise. So again, a criticism often levelled at our research assessment methodologies is that they don't match up to the standards of rigour that we would apply to our own academic research. So indicators are very poor proxy for the concepts that they seek or claim to indicate. Data's not supplied with error bars, poor survey methodologies, etc. So it's important that we draw on appropriate evaluation expertise when designing our evaluation approaches. Onto the actual framework now. So step one of SCOPE is to start with what do you value about the thing you're evaluating. It sounds obvious, but too often we don't start our evaluations here. We outsource our values to university rankings or funders, or we start with the data available to us and start there. And this is called the streetlight effect, illustrated by this cartoon. Where did you lose your wallet? In the park. So why are you looking here? Well, because this is where the streetlight is. You know, so many evaluations rely on bibliometric data, not because they care about it, but because it's readily available and easy to use. The C of SCOPE is a reminder to consider the context for our evaluation. We hear lots of arguments about which indicators are responsible and which are not, but we can't have that conversation without knowing the context, the why and the what in which that indicator is going to be used. There's lots of different reasons we might evaluate, and this matrix lists 6 key purposes alongside various entities of different sizes and attempts to identify the associated impacts and therefore risks of assessing in that context. And of course, discipline is another really key context consideration here. Then we have O, options for evaluating, and this is a reminder that we do have options. We don't have to reach for metrics all the time. There's all sorts of methods for assessment, and the important thing to consider here is whether your indicator is a suitable proxy for the thing you're evaluating. So the rule of thumb, I guess, is that generally speaking, quantitative measures should be used for quantifiable things, citations, publications, money, and qualitative measures for qualifiable things. And be very, very careful if you're using quantitative indicators as a sole proxy for qualitative things. The P of SCOPE is to probe any evaluation approach very carefully, and we think there's 4 key questions here. Who might this discriminate against? What might the unintended consequences be? How might it be gamed? And what is the cost benefit? And then the E of SCOPE is to evaluate, to run your evaluation and to evaluate it. And again, you can use SCOPE to help you do that evaluation piece. So that's SCOPE in a very brief nutshell. I just want to finish with a couple of UK university case studies that are using SCOPE to help them assess research more effectively at their institutions. And many of these were actually using SCOPE specifically to develop research culture related assessments such as culture KPIs. So Loughborough's responsible metrics policy or assessment policy is now based on SCOPE, and we've been using that for a number of evaluation designs. Newcastle University used SCOPE to develop their research culture index, and they wrote that up from Wonky, if you're interested in having a look at that. And then Kat, of course, who's coming to speak in a moment, at Leeds led a piece to use SCOPE to select metrics to track improvements in their research culture. Also, UCL, Reading, Surrey have also used SCOPE in various forms to assess things like open research and research culture more broadly. And there's lots of case studies on the INORMS website if you're interested in that. So that's my whistle-stop tour of research culture and assessment. Thank you so much for listening. I will pass back now to James.